Hey everyone, before we start today's episode, I wanted to quickly tell you about the membership drive that I am doing on patreon.com/FireTheseTimes to celebrate over 2 years of this podcast. If we hit the goal of 100 new supporters at $5 or more a month or 50 a year, I'll be able to hire a producer, which would give me more time to focus on the research and interviews and actually start releasing 2 episodes a week instead of 1. If you become a supporter, in addition to getting early access to all episodes, you will also have access to our monthly hangout, in which myself and everyone else who supports this project come together and chat about pretty much everything. It happens every month on a Saturday, and you have access to the link and everything related to that on Patreon. And lastly, if you cannot donate, you can still support by sharing this podcast with your friends and families and leaving a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever else you get your podcasts. This helps get more exposure to this podcast and introduce it to more folks. You can also follow this podcast and project on YouTube, Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, Substack, and of course the main website. So thanks again everyone, and I hope you enjoy this conversation. Okay, well, if it's okay with you, Alyssa, can you just start with introducing yourself to our listeners, and we'll take it from there.
All right, sounds good. I am Alyssa Hull. I am a writer, fiction and nonfiction in the United States, East Coast, and I'm also a science teacher. Currently, I teach high school, but previously I've taught at the college level as well. My background is in chemistry, and I sort of came to thinking and talking about climate change and environmental science and environmental justice through my engagement with sort of citizen science coming out of the Flint, Michigan water crisis.
All right, thanks for that. I read this article of yours that you've written in 2019, I believe. And so the title is, which obviously everything we talk about are included in the cliff notes and stuff. Hopepunk and Solarpunk on climate narratives that go beyond the apocalypse. And then the subtitle is like Alyssa Hull tries to find optimism in teaching cli-fi or climate fiction, for those who don't know, to terrified students. Talk to us a bit about that. I obviously will have a lot to talk about this. It's something that I definitely am very concerned about, how to talk about something that is quite obviously very terrifying or can seem very terrifying, especially to young folks. How did you first encounter this problem? If you can talk to us about that first.
So this article came almost directly out of a lot of conversations I had in summer of 2019. So at the time, I had this teaching job at the University of Delaware, and I was fortunate enough to find this conference workshop sort of thing in New York City called the Arctic Cycle, and it's since been renamed the Arts and Climates Initiative, and it's run by Chantal Bilodeau, who's a playwright. And she had basically said that she wanted to bring an interdisciplinary group of mainly artists, but also educators and scientists together to sort of have these conversations around the role of art, particularly in climate change. And I was interested in that because climate change is something that I have been worried about since I was a young child because I learned about it, and I'm sort of naturally an anxious person and who couldn't be. And it had been hanging over my head, but it was something that I had kind of compartmentalized. And going to this for me was a way to sort of bring in my education background, my background in science, and then I had worked in art museums for a while and am a writer myself. So this was kind of just the synthesis of many different kinds of thoughts. And it was a week in New York City, and it was this great opportunity to speak to people from playwrights, writers, photographers, painters, all these people who sort of felt that their background wasn't necessarily in science. They hadn't set out in their careers to think or talk about climate change, but they felt almost this like calling in this moment, in this upwelling. And this was really right after Extinction Rebellion and things like that were really taking off in the US and particularly New York City. And some of the conversations that came out of it, we talked to activists from around New York, and this was really around the time when those first pronouncements about we only have until 2030 to solve this issue, or we only have 18 months to solve this issue. And people were talking about climate change as apocalypse. And one of the really great things that we did in that workshop, which I'm forever indebted to all of the organizers for, was we looked at sort of the messaging. The framing of climate change like as apocalypse versus what are the good messages. I don't want to say that there's good messages coming out of climate change because it's so devastating, but what are the ways we can look at it in terms not of just as an ending, but as a beginning, a rekindling out of all of this potential horror and devastation? And is that something people, and I think particularly young people, can find there some seed or some kernel to not say it's the end? Because I honestly talk to students or young people and they think like 2030, like that's the end. Like they can't articulate anything beyond that. And so trying to explain that no, there's not an end, a severance, that there is going to be something beyond that. And it is within our power to decide now what that will be, is kind of where I started first thinking about, especially this framing, which is so Western, of climate change as apocalypse. And not that it's not bad, that it's not devastating, but that this is the only kind of cultural narrative we have to talk about something of this nature.
Yeah, and I guess immediately the first thing that comes to mind is just how disempowering thinking about climate change in this way is. And obviously, as you said, it's not that there isn't some kernel of truth to it. It's not that it's good in that sense. It's more that how can we frame something that's so complex and, yes, definitely bad in many ways, and might even get worse, and there's just so much to deal with for myself, and I've been thinking about this for quite some time. For a much younger person, I guess a good segue here would be to ask you, if that's okay, how do you feel, or how do you think educators, science educators specifically, what have they gotten? And this is kind of a generalized question, but what have they gotten wrong in past decade or 2 decades that we can now fix, if that makes sense?
I think there's two things that I'm going to talk about, and they seem almost contradictory. I think on the one hand, um, I think we can go kind of too hard or too soft in terms of our thinking. I think on the one hand, there's a tendency, and I think this really depends on the age of the students you're dealing with. So I deal with high schoolers, and I feel like this is something I wrestle with a lot. But I teach anywhere from 14 to 18-year-olds. And I don't want to be unrealistic. And I don't even want to be unrealistic with the really young children, my nephews, in my life either, about what we're facing. But also for me, I think reflecting on growing up, um, I think there were things that scared me so much that for so long I avoided dealing with the problem at all, feeling that it was completely insurmountable, or that it was only something that scientists could deal with. So I think on the one hand, that we have to hit the realism of it home in terms of what we know, that there's uncertainty about what we know might happen in the future, although there's certain paths, kind of like a hurricane tracker. That's usually the model or the metaphor I use with my students, that the science alone can't determine what human decisions we make that will affect the outcome. Um, but to also, I think, as science educators, I think this is more an issue at the sort of higher ed level, college level, university level, than for those who teach, say, elementary, middle, high school students here, that we're avoiding the emotional aspect of it. That this is something that people even now are almost calling sort of pre-traumatic stress disorder. That learning about these events and focusing on it, maybe especially from a natural disaster perspective, is really emotional. And to not acknowledge, to walk into a classroom and present this information sort of as facts, which they are, but then to not acknowledge the sort of emotional or existential burden that this places, not just having to witness, but also for young people to also be culpable, whether or not that's sort of the reality that we're facing, that they do feel that, one, they play a role in this, and two, that it is being left to them to clean it up. I think not dealing with the emotion is one of the ways that this problem has been avoided for so long, because it's easier to sort of deny or enter a state of numbness or shock than it is to confront those emotions, especially when teachers and students themselves don't have the resources to.
Yeah, I I think I can say that I've had a pretty similar trajectory in the sense that obviously I've mentioned this a number of times, but my background, so my undergrad was in environmental health, but that was in 2013 when I graduated. And up until recently, so almost a decade of a gap between when I essentially stopped. I'm not gonna say stopped thinking about climate change because that wouldn't be accurate, but stopped feeling like I could do something about it. And I would say a couple of years ago when I started to become a bit more active on this, 2, 3 years ago now, around when you wrote that article, actually, around 2019 or so. And in that period, the information that I had about climate change was so paralyzing. And that was, as I said, like that was in 2013, 2014, that it effectively prevented me from feeling that I can do something about it. And that sense, just that belief, which at the end of the day is a belief, because no one can tell me you can't argue your way out of out of convincing me, if you want, in that situation. Here I'm sort of trying to think out loud with you, that this can, like, I can do something about it or I cannot do something about it. At the end of the day, there is an element of belief in this. The visions that were around me back then, when I was doing that undergrad, when I was studying it as a scientist would, basically these are the facts, memorize the facts, reach some conclusions, and that's it. It didn't get to a point where this was also packaged in a way that gave me tools that to change those, to actually have an impact on the world. It was more like, this is happening, but you're not really involved in this. You're disconnected from this. You're not, there is nature, right? There is nature, and then there's you, and those are two separate things. Mm-hmm. There's the world, and then there's you, and those are two separate things. There's climate change, and there's you, and there's two separate things, etc. And I don't quite know what is the thing that moved me to sort of the other side, if you want. So like going back more into an activist framework, if you want to use that term or whatnot. I do think it was probably the Extinction Rebellion, the climate movements in general, the Fridays for the Future, and those kinds of things that definitely galvanized my interest again. And again, I don't even think interest, because I was always obsessed, but like the sense that I could do something about it. This is what really changed in the past 3 years. And one thing that has helped me, and this is where we get to the article especially, is this element of fiction. And this surprises a lot of people, because fiction, for the most part, is seen as, well, it can be entertaining, some good fun. Maybe it could be meaningful and deep and so on, but it's not practical. It's not, you don't read fiction necessarily because, as if you're reading non-fiction. There is this separation, which I tend to disagree with, actually, but maybe we can get into this a bit. But how did you get into, and I think most people already know by now because I've done a number of episodes on Solarpunk, but for those who don't know, how did you get into Solarpunk, and how would you define it? And how did it help you, if we can put it that way?
I think I came to it's and I think this is part of the nature of solar punk, that it is sort of this like very dispersed thing. So I came through it sort of just across like Tumblr, um, Twitter, sort of as an aesthetic. And there wasn't a lot out there at the time when I first sort of engaged with it. Sun Vault, the anthology, had just come out, but I was really looking for elements of it in works that I read, and sort of at the same time there was this similar movement that I think is there's maybe more marketing or sort of concrete labeling around this idea of hope punk, which is something that people like Becky Chambers, for example, writes, which I think directly sort of came out of the 2016 US presidential election, that people were really, um, I would say, liberal leaning and progressive people were just so devastated and shocked by what happened here in the election, that it seemed that there was like a rebellion against this sort of what at the time was on TV, Game of Thrones, sort of these grim, dark narratives, which again, very apocalyptic framing. And I was just looking for something that would frame the climate crisis in a way that was not so cut and dry, that it was not the final end, because I think when you find yourself thinking that, uh, that if you don't have the vision, and there don't seem to be a ton, or it's changing, but at the time I didn't personally feel, maybe because I wasn't reading broadly enough, that there were a ton of positive visions for what the future could be. I think a lot of Hollywood movies and a lot of novels, especially in the young adult market, are sold on being dystopian, and not that utopian is necessarily something that can exist. But I was reading this novel, Blackfish City, which I wrote about in the 2019 LitHub essay, and it is a bleak book in many ways. And I had bought it after hearing the author, Sam Miller, speak at a sort of book festival in Baltimore. And it's not a utopia by any stretch of the imagination. It's set in a future where there's sort of this floating city. It's a speculative fiction novel. There's elements of sort of magic, telepathy, mixed in with technology. Cities run by artificial intelligence, and there's clearly a case system. But to me, what was solar punk about it was sort of the resilience of the people to make a life out of something terrible that had happened, as well as sort of the collective action nature of it. It wasn't sort of these lone hero narratives that I think are so, um, have supported sort of a Western cultural mythos for so long, but are so antithetical to being able to do something really powerful about climate change or any environmental issue.
And since you said you're an educator and professor and teacher, how have your students reacted when you did, if you have brought Hopepunk and Solarpunk up? Have you seen any kind of difference compared to, let's say, a purely scientific based approach in education?
I try so many of my efforts to sort of, I was working with a fellow English teacher to try and get a eco literature unit off the ground, and then COVID sort of derailed everything. Um, as I'm sure is true for a lot of people, but I have sort of shifted um, my practice in teaching um, towards letting students at least write their own narrative. So I have the Arctic Cycle workshop that I mentioned uh, earlier, sort of at the beginning of our talk. came out of this book of plays that Chantal had written and commissioned, basically a playwright from every one of the 50 US states to write a short one act play about climate change. And every 2 years or so, they try to stage it in every state in the United States. And not all of them are what I would say solar punk, but a lot of them are. And so my first year, sort of following that article, which was it was right around the time of COP25, the United Nations conference. And so I had the students, basically, I read them, I did my sort of one person performance of one of these plays. And then I let them kind of take off and put the emphasis not so much on the science, that they didn't have to write a narrative or a story about the science, but that I wanted them to write about, and this was in my environmental science class, so not a writing based class, but I wanted them to write about a possible solution, something that could be done, so that way they could visualize themselves or parts of nature in the future. And also to get, I think, across what you said earlier, that kind of nature culture divide that is so pervasive in the West.
Mm-mm. So I had mentioned earlier that I'm in this climate anxiety group. It's just a kind of a discussion group. We meet every month, and it came out of just like a tweet that I put out some months ago. I asked people to, if anyone's sort of struggling with this, if you want to kind of get together and talk, and one thing leads to another, and we meet every month now, and there's, I would say, I think about 20 of us or something like that. And one of the this month and last month, one of the stuff we were doing is trying to figure out sort of like coping mechanism. So like we recognize what the problem is, we know what it is, but what is it doing to us, sort of like, emotionally, mentally, and obviously even physically at times, and what can we do about it? And the goal isn't to just survive, so to speak, which is important, and we can maybe talk about the importance of community survival as well, but also to kind of actually make us more. I struggle to use the word more productive or useful or whatever, because I don't like these terms, but just more effective maybe as activists, just like as people who want to be able to read the news, take it all in, or take as much as we can in, because sometimes we cannot take all of it in, and do something with that information, so that it's not just something we take in and then mull over for weeks and months and end up being really paralyzed about it and obviously helpless. And one of the many things that have come up, and was my own contribution as well as the contribution of a number of other participants, was the importance of fiction. And as I mentioned before, for a lot of people this sounds odd at first. As I said, fiction is not taken as seriously, I would say, by most people. And even when it is taken seriously, I don't necessarily think it's taken seriously in the sense of it being politically relevant. Or, politically relevant is the term I would use, like useful to our modern age, maybe is another way of putting it. Solarpunk has changed that for me. And not just Solarpunk, there are some other futurisms, like Star Trek is one that I mentioned at times, where it's just a matter of the story isn't necessarily always good. Even the books aren't all good. It's a very new genre, so some are better than others, and so on. I'm sure many of the best kinds of works have yet to be even written, let alone published. But they allow me to sort of place myself in a different mentality, but also a different context that doesn't exist around me. Like, that's the power of the imagination, right? And because it's solarpunk, and for those who don't know, solarpunk tends to have a lot of the ethos tends to be around like DIY culture, like do-it-yourself culture, community building, gardening, renewable energy tends to be. There's a lot of degrowth. There's a lot of you have all of those things. There tends to be a focus on what can we do about it? This is the DIY aspect of it. Like, we know this is a problem, we know this is bad, we know it is likely to get worse, especially given the current track we're in. But what can we do about it now? And how can we hold these different, how would I say this? These different potential futures at the same time. Like, we know there is, I'm kind of being simplistic about it here, but like, scenario A it feels like a catastrophe. Scenario B is slightly less so. Scenario C slightly less so. Scenario D, well, it's bad, but we're actually coping with it better than we thought we were, and we're even reversing some of the damage. We're getting into rewilding. We're getting into a number of different practices. All of those things tend to be absent from discourses around climate change. And I do think overall, and I think we have enough years behind us now that I feel like I can say this confidently, it's done more damage than good. Or at least it's done a lot of damage. I can, whatever. But it's definitely done a lot of damage. And I'm curious, it's like, obviously you wrote this in 2019, so like not that long before the pandemic started. We're very much still into it. And two years into this pandemic, we have, depending on where people listening are in the world, so I'm sure this changes depending on where you are, but generally speaking, there are a lot of there's a lot of talk of this being over, this no longer being a thing. There's a lot of fatigue, there's a lot of denialism, which is forcing its way against the medical community's best advice. And we're seeing again what I would describe, among other things, it's not the only component, as a lack of imagination, as a desire to quote unquote go back to normal, quote unquote normal, and not really thinking about how can we get out of getting out of this and getting out of this better as a society than we were when we entered into it. And these are the sort of things that I think Solarpunk has something to contribute to. And I admit it frustrates me a lot that we're not at a stage yet in terms of discussions, public discussions, the discourse, whatever we want to call it, where we take these things as much for granted as the fact that a 5-year-old today would know what a zombie apocalypse is, because those are cultural tropes that are everywhere in movies. They would know what a superhero is. They would know what the Avengers are. They would know all of those different things, but they wouldn't have necessarily the tools to actually impact their own present, let alone their future. Anyway, I rambled on a lot. I'm curious if you have any thoughts on, 2 years into the pandemic, how, if you had written this article today, for example, what are certain things that would have changed, let's say?
I think in many ways I have to sort of, there are things that make me, coming out of the pandemic, that make me slightly less optimistic, I'll say, than I was in 2019. I remember at the very beginning of the pandemic, like March 2019, I felt myself falling even into these traps that I've started teaching myself, my students about now, sort of the dolphins swimming in the canals of Venice because we are the virus. I think that was so easy to sort of in lockdown fall into, and now to sort of push back on, like, no, that's not a true statement. There are generally a small minority of people on the planet responsible, particularly living in the global north, for the catastrophe. So saying we are the virus just has a whole host of connotations. But it's hard to view sort of the resistance to what the medical experts say, the partisanship, and also this kind of desire to return to normal, when I think, like, a year and a half ago, people were thinking, well, normal wasn't working out so great at the time. And I think the convergence of the pandemic, in the United States, the George Floyd protests and Black Lives Matter. Um, a lot of that seemed at the time like this upswelling for change, and it is disappointing and hard to wrangle with now. This sort of um, it's pandemic exhaustion, which I try to tell myself in a way is normal, but I think it's revealed that there are things during the pandemic that I observed that I would find um, like in a way hopeful. Like the solar punk focuses on, I think, like I said, a lot of collective action, a lot of community survival, and I think despite the fact that people had to isolate, had to be away from each other, the sentiments were often shown in these like Hollywood disaster flicks, or like it's every person for themselves. And I definitely did not feel that way during the pandemic. I mean, there was hoarding on some accounts, but there was also these mutual aid societies. There were people, again, perhaps in the face of the failure of their governments to do so, people getting together to make DIY respirators and things like that. So I try to, in myself, balance um, the the positive sentiment with the negative sentiment. On the one hand, remembering that we tend to view the past like more positively, and we tend to catastrophize more about the future. And I'm sort of trying to ramp up for an Earth Day sort of pledge activity at my school right now. And just at least in terms of the United States, like looking at some of the like statistics about what people really believe. And the Yale Climate Change Communication Center has done a lot of studies about this, and almost 3 times as many Americans are either alarmed or concerned about climate change as they are doubtful or dismissive. So the dismissives are really a small population. I think that it's just that our political landscape has kind of been infiltrated by people who want to do nothing in order to increase their wealth or to maintain their wealth. And I, again, really think that's where the power of having these narratives of multiple people collectively being able to change a system, which is so hard. Uh, but and they kind of resist our what we want in most of our fiction, right? That we're not we're used to a protagonist, a sole protagonist. We don't have a ton of narratives that are written from a collectivist perspective. And so that's, I think, one of our cultural blind spots, besides this kind of framing of things as apocalypse.
Yeah, I always give the example of the movie I Am Legend with Will Smith, because one thing that movie, it's not just that movie, obviously, most movies of that genre do the same thing. But in that movie, most people, when they watch the movie, they think they are Will Smith. Like, they don't see themselves as the people who die in the first 2 minutes of that movie, right?
Yeah.
And what's that other one? A Quiet Place, where they're all surviving these aliens or whatever that can only, anyway, like people don't see themselves as, also again, like that family that dies in the first 4 minutes of the movie. They see themselves as like the protagonist, the family, the mother, the father, the teenage daughter, maybe, what have you. But you're always, so this is why I've been trying to focus more on solarpunk. This is an example I said I've mentioned a number of times. A lot of us, myself included, it is very easy for us to have a lot of cultural tropes, largely from Hollywood, that are focused around individuals, heroes, geniuses, hero geniuses, all of those different things. tends to be someone who knows a lot and or is very strong and or is very charismatic, but ultimately they just have something. They have some kind of skills, magic powers, superhero powers, whatever. What we see much less of, and this is where as a very passive gamer, like I'm not super active about it, but I'm very interested to see how this genre can also translate into video games, because if you think about it, video games is where you can have a lot of that playing out, like where its potential can maybe flourish the most, although it's not happening yet. Because role-playing games, creating adventures, getting to a point where you're building a community, maybe you're surviving an apocalypse as a community, what have you, can really offer us a way out of this very tired, I would say by now, um, tendency in movies, in video games. Again, with a lot of exceptions. This is just a generalized statement. And even a lot of fiction, like a lot of books. This is what Amitav Ghosh talked about in his The Great Derangement, which came out some years ago now. This difficulty of even imagining climate change in the near future. And we see it to this day, right? Like, not just, again, in those genres that I mentioned, but in politics. Like, we hear of what might happen to the European Union. And I'm in Switzerland, so I'm thinking about Europe. What might happen to Europe given now Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 5 years or in 10 years and 15 years. And the fact that the IPCC report came out 2 weeks ago doesn't factor in these calculations in the same way. There is a disconnect, and that disconnect um, partly is normal in the sense of everyone's afraid of their own mortality. We don't like to think about it. But partly we also know that there's a lot of lobbying, a lot of money, a lot of, especially the oil industry, obviously, that has put these kinds of, how would I say this? Um, well, a lot of money went into lobbying, went into prioritizing a lot of things that were individualistic. Recycle your plastic bottle, wear a sweater, reduce your energy consumption, that sort of thing. But just don't talk about travel less or whatever. But just don't talk about the overall system that makes these things into a problem in the first place. Um, and again, I guess what I'm trying to get at is that for me, Solarpunk, I don't write fiction. I like to read it, but I don't really write it. But I also see, like, quote unquote non-fiction applications to Solarpunk. I see, like, I had Andrew Dana Hudson as the first episode of this year, and he spoke about the political economy of Solarpunk, and I think there's a lot there as well. Do you see applications, going back to you being a science educator, given that many of students now have gone through 2 years of pandemic? And I don't know if this is a repetition of the previous question, but do you think that there is a way of actually talking about these things that seem to be, what's the word? I forgot what it's called, but hyperstruct. I don't remember, but like, yeah,
Hyperobjects?
there you go. Thanks. These
Yeah.
things are like hyper objects that are just so big and affecting us at the same time. We're unable to sort of cope with with what they are, even though most of us can recognize what they are. A pandemic sort of feels that way. Climate change definitely feels that way. Is there a way of sort of linking the two, if you see what I mean, to, yeah, to make students more able to think about it? I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, I do think in a way that the pandemic has created an opening. Um, I think because, right, for me sitting in my classroom, like, let's say, okay, 2 years, 2 months ago, the word pandemic itself did feel apocalyptic because we hadn't experienced anything. I mean, never in my lifetime. People were drawing parallels to the 1918 Spanish flu, and it's been devastating in many ways, but for many people, and we're still kind of dealing with the after effects of it, and we will be for a long time. But I think one of the things that it reinforces, or I'm trying to reinforce, is that there is this connectedness between us and people around the world, because I think that's important for my students, especially, and it's hard with teenagers to get them to recognize that our actions, what we do or fail to do to meet this crisis, does impact people who we may not even know, to think about sort of this nature culture divide, because as we push into more deforestation, more urban development, things like pandemics become more likely. So that's the sort of scientific side of it. But also to sort of see that the kind of fatigue, the kind of effects we're having that I think in the West, or at least in the United States, we thought we were immune to. And I think you see the same thing playing out, although we are very far removed, in many ways, but not all, from what's happening in Ukraine. But the idea that we were kind of at the end of human progress, that we had made it, and that, I think it has opened this door, for better or for worse. I think, like you said, confronting our mortality, which I think is why climate change is so terrifying to so many people, because we assume that we are going to live to a certain age and that we're not going to have to leave our houses in the middle of the night with our children because of a wildfire. So I think it's put the uncertainty, and again, this like very tenuous connection that we have to the world, maybe back at the forefront of our mind, at least for a while. And I think the returning to normal is sort of the fatigue of having to deal with that. And I think it's something that people do need time to sort of heal and recover and cope with everything they've been through, but that this is an opportunity, sort of post-pandemic, the economic possibilities, the geopolitical possibilities, that um, we we just have to kind of use this moment to remember that we don't know what's going to happen in the future, and that is a good thing and it's a bad thing. But it's also a good thing because nobody can guarantee what pathway exactly we're going to be on. And that is the space where I think hope can come in. And I think there will be plenty of people who write about the different trajectories looking backwards that the pandemic could have been on, and that may not be come out in time to be paralleled with what we can do right now for the climate crisis, but I think there's those possibilities there.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. There's this term like shifting baseline syndrome, um, which has both negative. Usually, the negative aspect is what's talked about, but it has this certain positive aspect in the sense that shifting baseline, for those who don't know, is like the idea. The usual example that's given is that a fisherman who is used to 100 whatever tons of fish per year, that's probably a lot, um, thinks that is a normal number, but let's say that that fisherman's father or mother, the normal for them would have been 200 or whatever. That what we consider normal changes. And obviously, the negative side of this is rather obvious, that you have someone born today or this year may not know many of the species that I took for granted growing up, for example. This is where it can especially get rather gloomy and frankly quite depressing. The sort of positive aspect of it is that the reverse is sort of also true. That if you have a rewilding project. I lived in Scotland for a couple of years, and there was a lot of moves towards rewilding, which is now kicking off actually a bit more throughout the UK and Ireland as well. Let's say an area that for me right now is quite barren, shipwrecked, as George Monbiot, the environmentalist, calls it. Um, if that area is rewilded in 20 years and it's a lush forest or what have you, someone who's born today would then maybe take that forest for granted, whereas for me it would be something completely new. So these things kind of work both ways. As it happens, we tend to think of the negative for obvious reasons. But my point is that it is possible to have the other way, and in the same way as it is just impossible for us, just like mentally, or at least for me and everyone I know, to comprehend even the scale of climate change. Like just the how deep is this? Like most projections stop at 2100, for example. Like how how are we cope? How are we going to cope with this in 5 years, in 10 years? Let alone in a month, to be honest. But obviously, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, if we want to be futuristic about it. And the answer is we pretty much just don't really know. It's really that simple. There's just so many unknowns there. We do know that the general trend is negative, and so we can project a bit ahead and have certain predictions here and there. But that's what they are. They're predictions. Some of them will be true. Some of them will turn out worse than the projections, and some might not. My point with all of this is that relying alone on the even likelihood, possibility, let's say, but even maybe likelihood that the near future is bad, and by near future I mean like the next couple of decades, let's say, maybe more. That in and of itself doesn't do much. Like that in and of itself doesn't, other than maybe paralyze us and make us feel helpless and depressed and all of that. But that in and of itself doesn't make us more effective communicators, activists, whatever other active professions. I don't know, other stuff. It doesn't really do that very well. Whereas for me, paradoxically, taking some time to quite literally switch off the news from time to time to indulge in this seeming luxury, just like reading about some kind of fictional book or watching Star Trek or whatever, actually allows me to, when I'm done with that, go back to the news. And here I'm being a bit reductive about it. Go back to the news and engage with that much more efficiently than I would have otherwise. And I feel like, I don't know if you would agree with this, but I feel like this is still taken for granted. It's still taken for granted that, or let me put it this way, a lot of, and this is from experience and from a lot of even that climate anxiety group I mentioned, a lot of people feel that if they don't keep up to date 24/7 effectively, they're sort of failing somehow, even morally failing. They're just not doing their duty. And I understand that, and to be honest, sometimes I do it myself. But there has to be a way of balancing that out with ways of actually acting upon that news. And this is where the imagination comes into play, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I agree with you 100%. I haven't read all of it, but I think that this is something that Adrienne Marie Brown talks about in her book Pleasure Activism as well. That and I'm myself on a like very strict news consumption diet because in a way, I wrote the 2019 article for myself because I need to find a way to go into my classroom and like walk that very fine line because it is like it's not alarmist, it is alarming, um, but also to not shut down the discussion. And I think that people who have kind of progressed and dealt with those like feelings of despair, hopelessness, and if you need to not read the news for a bit because people who I think are engaged in climate activism, climate storytelling, we're aware of I think the trajectories. So My time is definitely sometimes better spent doing that kind of nourishing, um, because otherwise I'm going to spend all my time holding in my head like the one horrible outcome, um, which again, do I know if that's realistic? Not, but my brain can come up with like hundreds of scenarios. But on the other hand, and in a way, it feels self-indulgent. Maybe it is, and it's hard to divorce it from sort of, I think, what we were talking about earlier. These kind of like greenwashing, emphasis on individual action, having to be this sort of ideologically pure environmentalist. That was like a very deliberate construction, um, of so many of these big oil companies, that's still ongoing. And it's also really interesting to read and think about how they infiltrate sort of elementary education, at least in the United States. But I think some of it comes from ourselves as well, coming from like a place of privilege. I know from my own upbringing, like I am not on the Marshall Islands. My community is not at risk in the next 2 to 5 years of just completely disappearing. And so, but I know that any step I can take, and again, there's this balancing act between the collective action, um, which is very powerful, and there are personal things that people can do that reducing, um, my carbon footprint in any way and engaging in climate action reduces the amount of parts per million greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, and that is a benefit, right? That is a small thing, that can hopefully put us on a track that's less bad. And sometimes in this crisis, if less bad is what we can strive for, then I think that's something that we have to, I don't want to say resign ourselves to, but accept that this is not necessarily an immediately reversible problem if it's ever reversible. And again, it's just because it's so hard. Um, I once had like a friend or colleague say, like, we don't like carry the memories of our generations physically with us. And it's hard to project ourselves so far into the future and so expansively because this is a hyper object, right? This plastic pollution in the ocean, the things that are happening in the Amazon. But to to take to do what you need to do individually so you can then move collectively.
Yeah, yeah, and this is, I think, if I'm not mistaken, Andrew Dana Hudson actually mentioned it when I last interviewed him. Um, he mentions this exact. I think it was him, but let's say it is. He had mentioned this example of when he became vegetarian. Although he knew that and for environmental reasons, he knew that in and of itself obviously wasn't gonna change the world, but it allowed him to almost place a sort of a and here I'm very badly paraphrasing, but it sort of allowed him to, when he would think about food, he has this extra thing now to think about. He had to make an effort. He couldn't take all of the food that he was eating for granted because obviously some of it now he wasn't eating anymore because he became vegetarian. Similar for me, I've been vegetarian for about 15 years now. One thing that I I I try and tell friends who are not vegetarians about it, that for me, food, for example, is never neutral. It's never I'm just getting ingredients from the supermarket, regardless of what they are, and making a meal out of it. I don't do it very well, but I do it a bit more than I think they do, which is I think about where this comes from and whatnot. And so just this decision, this personal decision, then leads to me thinking about the intersection, if you want, between food in and of itself, the thing that enters my mouth, and where it comes from and what kind of impact it has on the world and how can we do better. I know that George Monbiot, the environmental writer, has a book on this that is coming out, I believe, in a few months actually. People can check that out if they want. It's probably on his website. But because I know this because it's this insight, I did get it from Monbiot. I would credit him with that. And so there is this misconception, and I often see this online, that like because individual actions alone don't impact the wider trajectory of things, because there are billionaires that do enough damage in a single day than I might in a decade. Because, and that is true, and that should be tackled. That does not mean that the other extreme is also wrong. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't think about our individual actions. There is a balancing act, if only for the reason that I just mentioned, that you mentioned as well, which is that, but me telling myself that I can do this because I'm in Europe, that I can travel to most places around here by train, car, buses, what have you, rather than take the plane. That in of itself won't change everything, but it allows me to actually think about these different alternatives. At least for me, that's what sort of works for me. I'm not saying it works for everyone. And this would be the balancing act as far as I can see it. And Solarpunk allows me to do that because the DIY culture, common, mutual, communal gardening, that's what I was looking for. All of those other things, other than pick up useful skills that are nice to have, allow me to think, to be, or at least imagine myself being in situations where I start understanding how to live communally. I start understanding how to live in a certain community, and obviously, because of the specific circumstances in which we live, where so many things are online and what have you, also trying to think about how can we do this across borders rather than just in my immediate vicinity. This is obviously one of the challenges. And Solarpunk helps me with that. It gives me nice stories, it gives me nice settings, sometimes more than the stories themselves. I take a lot of I find the settings that I read myself into, if you want, sometimes even more useful than the story itself, to be honest. And it's what I see with video games as well. There are certain video games that I find very meaningful, not because the story is that important, and sometimes I actually skip the story altogether and I just walk around that world, but just because it allows me to picture myself in a different setting than the setting I'm currently in. It's really that simple. I guess we can sort of wrap up. And so I don't know if you have any sort of final thoughts or a question that I didn't ask or what have you. And if not, we can skip to the book section directly. But I don't know if you have any final thoughts.
Oh yeah, I was just thinking in terms of the thing that your video game comment, I'm thinking back from earlier, sort of the multiplayer aspect of it is so interesting, and that's such a unexplored avenue. One game that I played recently was an indie game. Is called, and this is the other thing I like about Solarpunk. I think the focus on like the small setting is so like that community aspect, and just like the richness of a small space and feeling grounded, because I think um, we like kind of connect to disconnect nowadays, especially with the internet, that we're globally connected, but that means we're also connected to nowhere. I think that goes back to your point about knowing this kind of vanishing of like the natural names of things, the names of birds, the names of plants. But one game I played recently is called Mutazione. It's this cute little indie game, maybe 2-3 hours, but it's really interesting. It's basically a game about gardening, and there's like an island, an asteroid hit it, and the people there have basically mutated. So I actually think there's a kind of like an apocalyptic beginning of that, and then it's kind of in a way post-apocalyptic afterwards. But the entire mechanism of the game is talking to people, getting seeds, and planting gardens. So it's like very sweet, very relaxing. Um, And then another game that I kind of like that I just started playing, and I think other people have talked about this one as well, is Cloud Gardens. It's basically just this little. Have you played it? Do you know what I'm talking about? It's there's no people in it. It's basically just kind of almost like a world builder where there's like an old road sign and you grow plants. And to me it's very much like a solar punk aesthetic, because that's kind of where I remember first seeing solar punky things, was kind of this green gardening permaculture even aesthetic, but like wreckage and trash, but kind of having it used in a way that is reminiscent of upcycling and just growing plants and connecting seeds. And I think about that because I think at the heart of it, solar punk is right. It's about like regenerative things, like literally energy from the sun being able to sort of regenerate our planet and in a way, I hope our cultural narratives.
What was the first game that you mentioned? I didn't catch the name.
Mutazione.
Mutualism?
Mutazione.
Okay.
I have to, yeah.
Okay. I'll put it in the description.
Yeah, I can send it to you as well.
Thanks. Yeah, there's a game. I don't actually know if it came out. I watched the trailer last year. It's called Common Hood. So common and then hood is HOOD. And it's a game that they describe themselves as, we're making a game where you take a post-crash community from surviving to thriving, essentially. I think there's only a trailer, but I might be mistaken. It's pretty fun. Or it would be fun. It will be fun.
That's exciting.
But yeah, those things are very much still happening now, and very likely there's going to be just much more of it. And it goes back to what we were saying, that in the same way as it's difficult for us to picture all of the bad stuff in the near future, even long-term future, there's going to be a lot of good stuff as well that we will take for granted. In the same way that we're taking for granted how easy it is for us to be on Zoom right now, when 10 years ago it would have been a bit more difficult. Well, we're on Zencaster actually, but whatever. All of these things, we do take them for granted at the end of the day. And this would be the positive side of shifting baseline, if you see what I mean. Okay, well, with that in mind, what are 3 books that you would recommend to our listeners, and why those 3?
Okay, so I have my 3. They are not. I have one fiction book, and it is Octavia Butler, Parable of the Sower. This is a book I started reading. I'm sure I'm far from the first person to recommend this book. Kind of, it is very much, I think, in the vein of, obviously not in the vein of, because she wrote this many years ago. It reminds me of Blackfish City, which was the book that kind of kicked off my 2019 essay. It's a classic. It's very dark. I'm really encouraged because the seniors at my high school in their English class are reading it now. It's dystopian and in a way apocalyptic, but the environmental and racial issues that it deals with, and kind of the like collective action. I always think of them in the beginning. There are these scenes with the protagonist making this acorn bread with her family because food is scarce, and I think it seems like something that could be happening in 5 or 10 years, and maybe a more negative trajectory that I hope we avoid. But I think it is just very important for our times. The other 2 are nonfiction. So we talked about The Great Derangement, but I really think Amitav Ghosh's The Nutmeg's Curse, which just came out, which is the story. I haven't finished it yet, but again, nonfiction. It talks about how basically this spice, the nutmeg, is connected to so much in environmental degradation, racial and geopolitics, and I think it just has a lot of important parallels for understanding the crisis that we're in. And then the last one, and I'm going to have my students actually read this summer, is Robert Macfarlane's Underland, because it's this one, I would say, not fiction, but this is my hopeful book, even though there are parts of it that are do really make me despair. It talks about the issues being faced by a lot of the indigenous communities of Greenland, but just also kind of the beauty and power and our historical connection to the natural world. And I think viewing it through this lens, this is, I think, the best book that I think people can read to maybe understand climate change and environmental issues as this hyperobject, because it really gets by looking at the literal spaces underground, our feet, the idea of the world, geological deep time, and it's just beautiful. So I think for people who need to feel that nature connection, it's just a really beautiful book.
Amazing. Alyssa, thank you a lot for your time. This was fantastic.
You're welcome. Thank you so much. It was a wonderful conversation. Defy These Times is hosted by myself, Joey Ayoub. I am also its producer, researcher, writer, and sound editor. If you want to help turn this project into a full-time job, please head out to patreon.com/firethesetimes to support it. These episodes are part of a bigger project which includes resources, a newsletter, and eventually YouTube video essays as well. As always, thank you for listening and take care.